This is BBC World News. I'm Samantha Simmons. Our top stories. Arriving for talks, Ukraine and Russia prepare to meet face-to-face. President Zelensky says he is willing to adopt neutral status.
I understand. It's impossible to force Russia completely from the Ukrainian territory. It would lead to the Third World War, and that is why I'm talking about a compromise.
British police are expected to issue the first fines for government parties held in breach of coronavirus restrictions. Unacceptable and inexcusable. Hollywood star Will Smith says sorry to comedian Chris Rock for slapping him at the Oscars. Queen Elizabeth hopes to make her first public appearance in 5 months to attend a Thanksgiving service for her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. For the first time in more than 2 weeks, Ukraine and Russia will hold face-to-face peace talks as Kiev pushes for a ceasefire. Presidential advisers from both countries will meet in Istanbul, although hopes of a breakthrough remain low. Well, this is the scene there live in Istanbul now. This is Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, where the negotiators will be meeting in the coming hours. Well, President Zelensky says negotiations must bring peace without delay and that Ukraine could make compromises, as our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen reports from Kyiv.
The Russians attacked an oil storage depot in western Ukraine. The war is settling into a deadly daily grind. Medics live and sleep at the hospitals. There's no time to get home. In one in Kyiv, the patients include a Ukrainian diplomat. Victoria said it was ironic that she was wounded in her own home when she came back from Belarus, Russia's ally. But I won't lie, she said, I'm very scared. Gennadi's home was also hit. The Russians thought they'd be greeted with hugs, he says. But if we don't get weapons to take the offensive, missiles and planes, the war's going to drag on for a long time. President Zelensky hinted at compromise to Russian journalists on Ukrainian neutrality and territory.
I understand. It's impossible to force Russia completely from the Ukrainian territory. It would lead to the Third World War. I understand it, and that is why I'm talking about a compromise.
In Kyiv, a few cafes are open and it's less tense than a month ago. Slava and Katerina were intrigued by what the president had said.
Nobody is saying we should give up the territories, but there should be some compromise or concession.
We hope that Putin is a sane person, but it's a very small hope.
But at the end of the lonely roads out to the frontline towns, the war feels much closer. In Borispil, facing the Russians to the east, people risk a trip to the market. But the mayor shows off his Ukrainian-made assault rifle and says that NATO's only choice is to give them the planes and the tanks they need to beat the Russians.
I think if Putin wins this war, they don't stop. Next will be Poland, maybe Romanian, Bulgarian, and other country in European Union. I think.
Biden and some of the other leaders have said that if they intervened in the war, if there was a no-fly zone, it could be World War III.
Maybe. But if they don't close the sky, they will be next.
Ukraine's president was right to talk about compromise, but it may never happen. Ceasefire agreements that work generally require either two sides fighting each other to exhaustion, or the weaker side making concessions because it fears defeat, or an outside intervention. None of those conditions applies in Ukraine at the moment. So the most likely option is a continuation of a war of attrition. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, I'm joined now by Jonah Fisher, who is in Lviv in western Ukraine, and Jenny Hill in Moscow. Welcome to you both. Jonah, if I can start with you, if you're still there. Is Jonah still there? Jonah, we can't quite see you, but I'm going to start with you because these talks are significant, that they are happening at all, but they've been organised at haste. What's your sense of what, if any, progress can be made, given the Ukrainian foreign minister has said they aren't trading land, people or sovereignty?
Yeah, I suppose the positive thing is that they're happening. It's very hard to see how it could possibly lead to some sort of peace agreement, because at this moment in time, Russia has not been explicitly clear on what its objectives in this war are. And until they have some sort of situation where Russia can walk away from this and say that it's got a win out of this war in Ukraine, it's very hard to see how it's going to come to an end. We did have talk on Friday that Russia may have limited its objectives in this war to eastern Ukraine, to taking territory around the so-called separatist republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. They have not yet achieved that. They are still battling to try and take control of the southeastern port town of Mariupol and have a lot of work still to do in eastern Ukraine. And I think that is the principal reason why it's unlikely that we'll see significant progress at these talks, because I think Russia is still hoping to take more territory on the ground. And until there is something which President Putin can sell to the Russian people as being a victory in this war, it's very unlikely that he's going to give the order to stop.
Well, let's talk to Jenny about what it is that Russia wants. Jenny, there is still a gulf, isn't there, between the Ukrainian position and the Russian position? And we don't exactly know, as Jonah says, what it is President Putin is going to compromise on. What's your sense of where the room for negotiation could be with Russia?
Well, look, the Kremlin's demands, in essence, haven't really changed. It's difficult, of course, to predict what Vladimir Putin's game plan really is, but we know that the Kremlin wants the international recognition of the independence of those breakaway regions in the east of the country, those Russian-speaking populations, which Vladimir Putin justifies his war in Ukraine by saying he's coming to their defense. So he wants the world to recognize those as independent, i.e., under Russian control. He also wants the world to recognise that Crimea, which he annexed in 2014, is Russian. Those are two big demands on the table, and we know that there might be some wiggle room in negotiations over those territories in eastern Ukraine, but we also know, of course, that President Zelensky of Ukraine has said all of that must be put to a referendum of the Ukrainian people. So it's very difficult to see how you might get any sense of compromise in the short term, but that is something that we know that negotiators are looking at. In terms of the sort of broader desires of the Kremlin here, we know that it does not want Ukraine to join NATO. That is something that Ukraine has signalled it's willing to consider, some sort of commitment that it would not join the bloc. That is something that the Kremlin will probably insist on. Beyond that, of course, it's very difficult to say. At the moment, the Kremlin spokesman has said that it's good that negotiations are happening in person, but very little beyond that. I don't think that we can be optimistic of any concrete outcome, certainly in the short term here.
Yeah, and of course, Jonah, it's not the country's foreign ministers meeting, it is negotiators, and there is significance in that, isn't there?
It's presidential advisors, basically, from both Ukraine and Russia. What President Zelensky here in Ukraine has been wanting for a long time and calling for openly is a discussion directly with President Putin himself. I think there is a feeling here amongst the leading figures in the Zelensky administration that they aren't actually going to get anywhere in talks unless they actually talk to President Putin himself directly, and that's when things might just be possibly thrashed out between the two leaders. But at this point in time, I think the position very much from Moscow on face-to-face talks between the two presidents has been until there's really something substantive that might actually lead to some sort of agreement. There's no point in the two presidents actually coming together for talks.
Yeah, and Jenny, I think most would agree, wouldn't they, that there is only one person who can end this, and it is President Putin.
Yeah, and as I'm sure you know, President Putin himself has said he's not willing to sit down and discuss this at leader level until there's really something to announce. He wants the rest of the delegations to try and thrash something out. I think it's sensible to question how serious Russia is about some kind of peace agreement. We know, of course, that experts in the West say the war isn't going the way that Vladimir Putin had expected or hoped it to, and that there is therefore perhaps some pressure on him to bring this to an end. He is going to have to at some point explain to people here in Russia why soldiers are dying in Ukraine, and presumably to tell them that this is a special military operation, as he calls it, isn't going to last forever. But as Jonah said earlier, he is going to have to present this as a victory. So he's going to have to get something really substantial out of these talks. We still don't know his game plan. And I think it's also worth mentioning that whilst there are reports out there talking about perhaps the Kremlin's position shifting a little bit, about the fact that perhaps its demands might be narrowing, it's still worth mentioning that the foreign minister here, for example, yesterday, as other officials have done in the past few weeks, still maintains that this is about the demilitarization and the so-called denazification of Ukraine. These are broad aims. They're very difficult to really pin down. What does he mean by that? Many have assumed all the way through that what Moscow wants really is a change of leadership in Kyiv. Now, we know that the Kremlin has said that's not what it's after, but of course it also said it wasn't going to invade Ukraine, and we've seen what happened. So it's very difficult at this stage, I think, to assess exactly what it is that the Kremlin really wants, what it's prepared to compromise on, and we've not seen any evidence that it is willing to compromise on anything at this stage. There's been no ceasefire. War is continuing, and more broadly, what Vladimir Putin here really wants.
Okay, Jenny Hill in Moscow and Jonah Fisher in Lviv. Thank you both. Well, let's just show you the scene outside the palace in Istanbul where those talks are going to be taking place. This is the Dolmabahce Palace. The talks are expected to begin in the next 20 minutes or so between those presidential advisors to both Ukraine and Russia. And we just had an update as well from the Ministry of Defence here in the UK, talking about, as they do every day, their assessment of the situation in Ukraine. They've said that Russia poses a significant threat to Kyiv through their strike capability, even though Ukrainian forces continue localised counterattacks in the northwest of the city. They said they've maintained their offensive on Mariupol with continuous heavy shelling of the city. Of course, we'll keep you updated on those talks and the situation in Ukraine throughout the day. Now, though, here in the UK, the police are to issue the first fines in relation to government parties that took place during COVID-19 lockdowns. It's thought 15 fines will be given initially, and it could be as soon as today. There's no word yet on whether the Prime Minister will be among those receiving one. Well, let's talk to our political correspondent, Adam Fleming, who joins us from Westminster. Hi, Adam, good to see you. Well, news on this story, much long awaited, and it could be coming in the next few hours. What are you hearing?
Well, there's a lot of expectation and a lot of speculation. The expectation is that after 2 months of investigating, the Metropolitan Police, the police force in London, are ready to issue the first fines to people for breaking the lockdown rules, for holding events in government buildings in central London at various points in 2020 and 2021, when everyone else in England was living under some form of lockdown rules and those sorts of events were banned. And we think that maybe there could be about 15 fines issued in this first wave. So that's the expectation. The speculation is who is going to get those fines and why. One theory is that this is the open and shut cases of really egregious breaches of the rules where there was no room for interpretation, or perhaps the person themselves just put their hands up and said, yes, I broke the rules, here are the details. Another theory is that actually it's just the order in which the police have been investigating individuals, because what the police did was send questionnaires to people they wanted to get more data from, and the Prime Minister was amongst one of the first to get one of those questionnaires and send it back. So is it being kind of sliced and diced that way? Then the other difficulty we're all going to have comprehending this story is just working out who's got these fines. So the Prime Minister has said he will let it be known if he gets one. Then other government ministers are involved, but will they be as candid as him? And then you've got the civil service. Okay, you can expect maybe there's an expectation of very senior civil servants to front up if they've been fined, because that calls into question their professional judgment. But then much more junior civil servants who aren't public figures but are part of this, they're probably not going to front up and say that they've been fined. So it's going to be quite a confusing couple of hours, I think. And also, I think the police will have to make clear whether this is just the start of the law enforcement process or this is just the end. If it is the end, that then triggers a few other things, doesn't it? There's the political process amongst the Conservative Party where MPs will finally be able to reach a judgment on Boris Johnson's judgment himself and his leadership. And then there's the civil service process, because the senior civil servant, Sue Gray, who was tasked with looking into this from a civil service point of view, she could not publish the full details of what she found because the police had asked her to hold those back while they were investigating. So when the police investigation comes to an end, Sue Gray can then publish her detailed report. And remember, she spoke to loads and loads of people and had something like 500 pages of evidence and 300 photos. So a load more detail will come out that way.
Adam, we look forward to hearing it all from you when it does. Thank you. Stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, Queen Elizabeth hopes to make her first public appearance in 5 months to attend a Thanksgiving service for her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh.
The accident that happened here was of the sort that can at worst produce a meltdown. In this case, the precautions worked, but they didn't work quite well enough to prevent some old fears about the safety features of these stations from resurfacing.
The Republic of Ireland has become the first country in the world to ban smoking in the workplace. From today, anyone lighting up in offices, businesses, pubs and restaurants will face a heavy fine.
The president was on his way out of the Washington Hilton Hotel where he had been addressing a trade union conference. The small crowd outside included his assailant.
It has become a symbol of Paris. 100 years ago, many Parisians wished it had never been built. The Eiffel Tower's birthday is being marked by a reenactment of the first ascent by Gustave Eiffel.
This is BBC World News, our top story. For the first time in more than 2 weeks, Ukraine and Russia will hold face-to-face peace talks as Kyiv pushes for a ceasefire. Well, let's get more now on those talks between Ukraine and Russia. I'm joined by Ilnur Chevik, Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and a member of the Presidential Security and Foreign Policy Council. Welcome to you. Thank you very much for being with us. And what potential solutions do you see on the table today for these talks?
Well, it depends on the two sides, of course. Turkey is being an honest broker. Turkey is the only country that the two countries trust. Turkey is the only country that the two sides talk to. So Turkey is trying to broker a kind of mediation. But, of course, it is up to the two sides. What kind of a solution? We don't know. It's on the tables. Our officials now, at the moment, are meeting the two delegations to bridge some of the gaps, maybe, but it depends on how the talks go. Turkey is here to help out for peace in the region. We have a vested interest. It is our region. We don't want any complications, and we don't want a full-scale war. So we're trying to prevent a catastrophe. But, of course, the solution depends on how much the two sides are prepared to give and take.
One potential solution reportedly being pushed by your country's administration is for the Donbass and Crimea to be held by Russia under long-term lease, which is kind of similar to that employed by the UK in Hong Kong previously. What's your assessment of that?
Well, again, there is a kind of desperation. The two sides have reached a kind of critical point in the war. The Russians are at a standstill. Yes, they are gaining and gaining, but very slow. They expected this thing to end in a month. It didn't, in a couple of days, sorry, but it didn't. It went on, and now we're past the month. So they're not getting a quick solution there, and they are becoming more desperate because maybe they too need a honorable exit. So I think Turkey is here to facilitate this. On the other side, of course, the Ukrainians are paying a heavy toll. So the two sides may well be ripe for a kind of give and take. Now, I don't know how it will develop, of course.
Given that President Zelensky has said to Russian journalists in the past few days that he's willing to seek a compromise with respect to neutrality, but only after a referendum, do you think there's more to work with at these talks than there were 2 weeks ago?
Yes, definitely, because a referendum means the time dragging on. This kind of thing takes time, and I don't think the Russians would be very happy to give them that time. They want a kind of exit from all this, I feel. So it'll just be dragging their feet. So I think the Ukrainians have to agree that some kind of constitutional change is needed, especially on their membership to NATO.
You said that Russia expected this to be over in a couple of days. You clearly have high-level talks with Russian senior officials. What have they said to you about where President Putin is ready to draw a line here? What could possibly be, in your view, his exit strategy?
We're not getting a kind of feedback from the Russians about Putin's intentions, but that's a closed case for us. But the problem is that we are seeing on the ground that they did not get what they wanted in the period, in the short period. So they are too in a very tight situation. Their economy is not going well. I mean, the sanctions are biting hard. So and the people are not very happy back in Russia. So Putin, I am sure, wants a way out.
Okay. Ilnur Çevik, Chief Advisor on Foreign Policy to the Turkish President. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hollywood actor Will Smith has apologised to Chris Rock for slapping him during the Oscars ceremony on Sunday night. In a statement posted on his Instagram account, he describes his behaviour as unacceptable and inexcusable and said he deeply regretted his actions. A service of thanksgiving for the life of the Duke of Edinburgh, who died last April, is taking place at Westminster Abbey later on Tuesday morning. Buckingham Palace has indicated a last-minute decision will be taken as to whether the Queen, who's facing mobility issues, will be able to attend. Here's our royal correspondent, Daniela Ralph.
It will be just as he'd wanted it. Prince Philip had requested many of the elements in the Thanksgiving, and since his death, the Queen has overseen the service. Much of today would have been part of last year's funeral, but COVID meant restrictions, with just 30 guests, no singing from the congregation, and that image of an isolated, masked Queen.
That sense of loneliness is so desolate, actually, in the feeling, for the country and the whole Commonwealth to be able to give thanks for this amazing marriage, for two people who devoted themselves to each other and then to duty and service of others. A chance to say thank you, I think, would be wonderful, and healing as well at the same time.
The Thanksgiving service here for Prince Philip will be a celebration of his contribution to public life. Westminster Abbey will be full of family, friends, and those organisations he worked so closely with over the years.
The service includes many personal touches. The congregation will sing the hymn "Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer," as requested by Prince Philip. Clergy from the royal estates will offer prayers to reflect his active role in managing the estates. And flowers will include sea holly to mark his naval career and lifelong affection for the sea.
As DV ambassadors, we use our voice.
Also playing a key role today will be the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, created to empower young people, many of whom will be at the Abbey to show their appreciation.
He was incredibly active in the award He attended all of our Gold Award presentations, so he would, and that's one of the things I understand that he really enjoyed. He loved meeting young people and hearing about their stories and, you know, what they'd got up to on the award. And I think, you know, just as a man, he was just a real champion for the power and potential of young people.
The public servant, the naval commander, and the family man. All aspects of Prince Philip's life will be remembered today. Daniela Ralph, BBC News, Westminster Abbey.
And we'll have more on that remembrance service in the coming hours here on BBC World News. Now, just before we go, let's take you back live to Istanbul and the palace there, where delegations from Ukraine and Russia are arriving to start those talks. We're expecting them to get underway in the next 5 minutes or so. These are the first face-to-face talks between representatives of the two countries in more than 2 weeks. But our current correspondents are saying that there is a pretty hurried feel to them, only organised really in the past few hours. The Russians indeed landed just last night, and the Ukrainian delegation even later, after what they described as logistical delays. Turkey's leader had held a phone call a day earlier with President Putin. Mr. Erdogan has been trying to position his country as a key mediator, and in the call he urged the Kremlin for a ceasefire. We'll have plenty more, of course, on any lines we get out of those talks in the coming hours. Do stay with us here on BBC World News.
Hello. For much of last week, high pressure was the weather maker across Europe. This week, things look very different. Low pressure is increasingly taking control. Low pressure wobbling its way in from the west. We've seen some pretty wet weather lately across parts of Spain, especially down towards the southeast. There is some